Welcome back. This is week one, lecture two, with the title Medieval Christendom. And we begin the content lectures of this course with the Middle Ages and medieval Christendom for a variety of reasons. I mean, this is a course on the Reformation, but as I talked about in the previous lecture, the Reformation as such is a concept. It is a categorical term that refers to a number of developments and people and texts and things, um, and what transpired during this period that we label and refer to as the Reformation is difficult to really get at and what it really means and what is the Reformation, which is one of the major questions I hope you'll be asking yourselves during this course. That's certainly the approach that I take. How do we come to an understanding of whatever this is that historians have called the Reformation? And will be discussing like three basic approaches, or not approaches, but patterns of the Reformation, so to speak, in the broad sense. And the first is the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And then there's Luther's Reformation, and then various developments therefrom, or just various patterns of Reformation. So there's kind of three distinct stages of development, if you will. What we can see is overall, when we look at it, Europe in 1300 was very different from Europe in 1600. And the question is, how do we get from Europe in 1300 to Europe in 1600? What happens? What is the catalyst or catalytic agents for this change, for this transformation? And if we're looking at change, we can only determine change when we see what change was changed from. And so, if we're going to be talking about the Reformation, we need to look at the medieval background to some extent in order to see what is new and distinct and what isn't, and what is just simply a continuation of medieval traditions. And one clear example of this, I think I talked about this a little bit in the previous lecture as well. When Luther stood at the Diet of Worms and appealed to his conscience, saying, unless I can be convinced from Scripture, it would be a sin to go against my conscience. Therefore, I will not and cannot recant. God help me, amen. That was a medieval basic principle, and so we can't point to that as being the harbinger of modernity, as it has been by scholars. They say, look at Luther. This is an issue of individualism, and individualism standing up over against the authority of the Catholic Church. This related then to the Renaissance and this Renaissance understanding of the individual. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to squeeze in Renaissance developments as well, but they were certainly there, and contributing factors as well. And so if we don't really understand what is new and different, we're not going to understand what this concept really refers to. And also we won't understand what impact Luther or the other participants actually had. And that will lead to this kind of warped understanding of what this thing is called the Reformation. Now, it's not a thing, it's a concept. We can't take the Reformation, place it on a dissecting table, and look at it. But we can look at what transpired, what were some of the new elements that came about in the 16th century, and what made them new, and why were they new, and what impact did they make. In so many ways, that is what we're kind of getting at. And then how do we describe those changes? And I think I referenced again in last lecture that your final exam is asking the question of whether or not the Reformation was a revolution. So that is, again, a concept that we need to question because it will affect how we understand whatever it is we're referring to when we use the term the Reformation. Was it a revolution or was it not? Was it reform, simply a continuation of reform movements? Or was it something new and different? And if so, how so? That is the big question. Because again, so often scholars have pointed to the Renaissance and then the Reformation as being the origins of modernity. Modernity is a problematic term because it simply means like us. Um, and certainly in the 14th century, there was the concept of modernity. In the 12th century, there was the concept of modernity. And it always meant like we recent people compared to the old-fashioned, out-of-date people, or the antiqui in the Latin term, the antiqui and the modernity. Um, and so it was modernity how we define it, or as it has been defined by not contemporary scholars, but let's say 19th and 20th century scholars, and still the definitions we're working with. Um, we read back then into history and see, oh, there we see something like us, and we refer to that as then the beginnings of modernity, or something along those lines. And that is really an ahistorical approach. What we need to do is go back and try to understand the situation, the beginning, so to speak, of change, to see what was really going on. So that is why we start with medieval Christendom in the Middle Ages. There's obviously no way that I can squeeze. Actually, I teach two courses on the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, and the High and Later Middle Ages. And there's no way I can really squeeze two full semester courses into one lecture. But there are some basic structures um, and concepts of the Middle Ages, and again, this term Middle Christendom, which I'll be discussing in more depth, defining, um, that we are essential to understand. I was going to say that we have to understand. We do. It's essential um, to understand what comes thereafter and what the distinction and the difference is made. And I think we'll see that so often what has been taken as new and uh, innovative and an origin of something that is had not been before is actually just either a slightly altered version of something that had already been very well present in the Middle Ages, or it is simply a continuation of a medieval understanding. Now, that kind of being said in the overarching view, I'll be picking out just a couple of um, topics to present to you that I think are essential for understanding the developments in the 16th century and what was going on. And the first of those is the concept of Christendom. And then I'll be addressing the ecclesiastical and lay hierarchies, which is actually getting at what is the church. And I'll be getting there when I get there. And then dealing with monasticism. Because, again, that is the origins out of which Luther grew and developed his theology and initiated his attack and everything else. So we'll get to all those things. But if we don't understand some of the background, we're not going to understand where Luther was coming from. That being said, uh, hold on. I'll do my best to get through all of this and keep it kind of focused, as focused as I possibly can, without letting myself get too off on important, in my view, essential topics that are necessary for understanding the Middle Ages. Because if we start talking about understanding the Middle Ages, then we're back to the two-course approach that we'd be here for another year and a half or so before we ever really got to the Reformation. So, that being said, keep in mind that this is not the sum total of the Middle Ages by any means, but simply providing the requisite background to understand the developments in the 16th century and thereafter. Okay, cool. Here we go. And first concept that we're going to be talking about, again, is medieval Christendom, because that's the kind of the overarching term that I want to describe, because what happens is medieval Christendom becomes transformed, or as I will be saying later, begins to crumble, disintegrate, and is replaced with something else. I'll be getting to what that is replaced with. Now, medieval Christendom is I refer to as a myth of medieval Christendom. In this course, in all my courses, I use the term myth in a very particular way. So often, in common parlance, we use the word myth as simply the opposite of what is true. Well, that's not true. That's just a myth. That's not actuality. That's not reality. That's just a myth. And then we also use it in terms of Roman mythology, or the myth of X, Y, and Z, as almost a story. Stories, particular time. But as I use the term, myth is an account, a concept that allows us to make sense of our experience that cannot be reduced to concrete or quote-unquote scientific analysis. And it also referred to it as mythopoetic truth. There are different levels of truth, and mythopoetic is true, I would argue. One good example of that is love. Any of you have ever been in love? Very strange state to be in. And so it is something that takes us out of ordinary time, so to speak. But it gets at a reality, because when you're in love, you do really crazy things. And we can't really reduce love, and here I'm talking about romantic love, to, the evolutionary biological instinct to reproduce. Sometimes it might be a help if we did reduce it to that, to see that's really the physical aspect behind it. But it is real. It is more than that. And these myths, which are the kind of stories we tell ourselves that allow us to make sense of the world in which we find ourselves, that cannot be reduced to something physical, cannot be reduced to something that we can identify and label and dissect on an operating table or a dissecting table, a laboratory. But myth is so important. And what kind of happens in the Reformation, as I will be arguing throughout this course, is this myth of Christendom becomes transformed and replaced by the myth of the nation state. But we'll get there when we get there. And so we're going to begin with concept of Christendom and the myth that develops therefrom. That being said, we finally now move to the first slide, on the second slide, I guess, actually, on the PowerPoint, the concept of Christendom. And the first point there is the myth of Rome. Now, we can't really understand the myth of Christendom without understanding the myth of Rome. That's one of the problems with history, is when do we start, and can we really understand the arbitrary point which we claim we're going to begin our account without keep going further back and further back and further back. But what I mean by the myth of Rome here, I'm just going to be very give an even briefer presentation of the history of Rome, so to speak, is essential because what happened was the myth of Rome became transformed into the myth of Christendom. And then only in the 16th century, Christendom finally crumble and disintegrate and being replaced by. So it wasn't that the myth of Christendom replaced the myth of Rome, but the myth of Rome became transformed into the myth of Christendom. So what was the myth of Rome? I'm assuming you all heard about the Roman Empire. There's various discussions of what that entails, and empire in terms of a form of government, an emperor, and empire in terms of the political hegemonic control over territories greater than your own state. So that Rome was an empire before it was ever an empire. It was a republic. Rome, first been ruled by kings, and in 509 BCE, group of citizens rose up and threw out the king, the tyrant, and they viewed it as established a republic. And then the republic fell with Julius Caesar, and then the rise of Caesar Augustus, or Octavian. And Octavian had a problem, because he wanted to really transform the consciousness of the citizens and even all of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire to see that he was really the one in charge. He established what's called a principate, the rule of a single person. He was not officially the emperor. Emperor, actually, the Latin term imperium just means command. So actually, who had command of the armies had imperium over those armies. That's a huge transformation. When you're used to being a republic for 500 years, to all of a sudden see that one person is calling the shots. Now, neither Julius Caesar nor Augustus got rid of the Senate. Julius Caesar sort of did, but the Senate also was what the senators also rose up and assassinated Caesar. But Octavian tries to transform people's minds and understandings. He does that in a series of ways, by placing his image coinage, which was kind of a new innovation within Rome. by establishing a particular image of himself, sculpture that had to be set up in the town square of all the cities and towns in Rome, and by also writing about himself, but also by um, basically hiring the poet Virgil to write a new history of Rome. And Virgil did that in his great poem and masterpiece, the Aeneid. And here we find the explication of eternal Rome. Probably have heard of eternal Rome. That really begins with Virgil, because he is writing about the Trojan War, going all the way back to the Greeks. He's in some ways rewriting Homer. I mean, Homer means anything to any of you with the Iliad and the Odyssey. For the Romans. So he takes the Trojan side, to speak, and that was the origins and foundation of Rome. And in Virgil's poem and presentation, this is not only the origins of what was become the Roman Empire, but it's a divinely sanctioned one. It is one that Jupiter had promised would come about, that the Romans were destined by divine sanction to rule the world, and their empire would have no end, be bounded only by the skies and the seas. It was pretty impressive. I would love to spend a lot of time talking about the Aeneid and how that was all constructed, and the ambiguity of some of those concepts too. But the point is this idea of this eternally divine sanctioned empire to rule the world. And why? To protect the weak, to do good for society, to be a just rule. That was very powerful, and it did catch on. And what happened is that myth became Christianized, because Virgil is writing just shortly before Christianity starts emerging. If you go back to the Gospel of Luke, the reign of Caesar Augustus, and decree went out that all the world should be taxed. That is the same Augustus, Caesar Augustus. And so it is a very fascinating development, because Christianity, within the course of the 4th century CE, went from being a persecuted religion within the Roman Empire, Diocletian's final attempt to rid the world of Christianity and his great persecution of 303 to 305, to then being a legal religion, because Diocletian saw that his great persecution wasn't going to really work and wasn't going to wipe out Christianity. So he abdicated and resigned, and power struggle, and Emperor Constantine rose to power and made Christianity legal. And then Constantine, too, moved the capital to Constantinople. Constantine called the Council of Nicaea, which established a lot of the fundamental positions of Christian doctrine. At Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, under the leadership of Constantine, they established the Creed, Nicene Creed, which is still a fundamental creedal statement of Christianity. They determined it was one of the early lists of the books of the Bible, the canon, the canonical books, because there were other Christian writings that were circulating that were not seen as being divinely inspired, or not to the same extent to what was, the question was, what really consists of Scripture. And that was determined at the Council of Nicaea, led by Constantine. And they also then condemned Arianism and some other things. There was some Christological issues, theological issues being defined, the canon being defined, and the creedal statements being defined. So it's a major issue. From this point on, becomes very much of a tension, because Constantine was the emperor. And the council, yes, it was attended by the bishops and the abbots, but primarily bishops, so at the time. But it was under the direction of Constantine. So the question then becomes, very early on, what's the relationship between Christianity and the emperor, or the empire? It's only then at the end of the 4th century, with Theodosius, in 391, a series of decrees from 391 to 394, that proclaims Christianity the only legal religion of Rome. This is a huge transformation. Hope you can see that and understand it. Huge transformation. And in doing so, this whole concept of the myth of Rome became Christianized. And by a series of events, again, which would be too complex to go into, after the death of Theodosius in 395, and we had the so-called fall of Rome that was never didn't really ever fall, at least in their own eyes. The term the fall of Rome is out of Edward Gibbon. 5-volume classic study, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, with the first volume having been published in 1776. Before then, there was no concept of the fall of Rome. But what was emerging in this transformation of now this Christian Roman Empire, but eventually in Charlemagne's empire, we'll get to shortly, became the myth of Christendom, and the Christian Empire. But first, we need to look at what is this definition of the myth of Christendom, as distinct from the myth of Rome, because it was simply an added factor to this myth of Rome. So the Christendom, it's not simply Christianity. It's been argued, this is not my argument, but it's been argued that when we find, Christianitas in the sources, in Latin, Christianitas, we translate that as Christendom, not as Christianity. Because Christendom, here on the slide, we have the myth of Christendom and the definition, was a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. Now, that means that there's a political element as well as a religious element. And one of the things I didn't discuss as much as I should have in previous lectures is the distinction between religion and theology. Religion is the practice of beliefs put into practice. Theology is the academic reflection on and analysis of beliefs, just for a simple definition. And so Christendom was a theological concept, and it was also a religious concept. And early on, even with Charlemagne's empire, what it meant was you were baptized and you attended Christian mass, Christian worshipped Christianity, worship God, Christian version. That was essentially all it meant. It did not mean that you believed certain things. Yes, there was the Nicene Creed that was the basis for Orthodox position. Orthodoxy being defined as the correct belief, the right belief. But it was not a morality. It's not a highly developed. We looked at, before Constantine, Gregory of Tours and his History of the Franks, who were the kind of first political entity to become Christian following Roman Christian, Orthodox Christianity. The Franks were, these bloodthirsty people. And it's a fantastic read, Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks, in the end of the 6th century. And I often assign it my early medieval course and everything else because, we see, I say, these good Frankish Christian family values when we have brothers killing brothers and, mothers advocating for the murders of their sons because it's all political machinations. And Gregory is not a moralist. Gregory doesn't necessarily condemn all these. He doesn't say they're good. He just kind of reports on them. And it takes a while before Christianity becomes this concept of a way of life. So this kind of geopolitical entity bounded by the boundaries of Christian worship, defined by the boundaries of Christian worship, is just that. Baptism and Christian worship, that is the Mass. And so anytime that geographical area where Christianity was practiced expands, Christianity expands, Christendom expands. And with Charlemagne, we have the most extensive geographical territory ruled by a single ruler, number one, since the so-called fall of Rome, and number two, the expansion of Christianity. Because a lot of these Germanic tribes that ended up settling within the empire, especially north of the Alps, that's a whole process of amalgamation, and complex one as well. Certainly, we should not talk about the so-called barbarian invasions as they're so often referred to. There was no such thing as the barbarian invasions. That's another issue again. I have to go back and take my early medieval course. But it is an issue of imposing a unit based, again, on practice, on religion, on baptism, Christian worship. For Charlemagne, that was a major issue. Now, with Charlemagne, it was also an amazing figure. He was called, Charles, but it's called Charles the Great, and in French that is Charlemagne, and with good reason. He instituted what's called the Carolingian Renaissance, brought scholars to his capital in Aachen to write a series of textbooks to standardize the text of the Bible, and to do a number of other scholarly things and aspects of the court. And it is in that context we have scholars first referring to the Christian empire, the Imperium Christianum, the Christian people, Populus Christianus. This concept of the Christian people, the Christian empire, really emerges with Charlemagne, and that is really identified as Christendom fully blown by the myth of Rome and this myth of this Christian empire. Footnote, I'll talk about this shortly again. Charlemagne was not, when he was crowned Roman Emperor in 800 by the Pope, he was not crowned Holy Roman Emperor. It was seen at the time as a continuation of Rome. And the emperor was the same emperor in the same office that had always been there. That, too, is a long, complex development, which would take us too far afield to talk about right now. But that distinction is important. So this idea of medieval Christendom as the Christian empire, Christianum, Imperium Christianum, was seen as the continuation of Rome. God's empire, God's established, ordained empire to rule the world and bring peace to the world. That was the mindset and the concept. When Charlemagne extends to the furthest extent, because not everybody had been Christianized. In 814, for example, Charlemagne finally defeated the Saxons up in northern Germany. They had been pagan, not Christian. Then issues a document that describes, now what do we do? How do we, since we've conquered them, how do we rule them? And one thing was the imposition of Christianity, where they had to follow Christianity. Again, it wasn't a change of heart necessarily. It wasn't a change of belief. It was simply, you have to be baptized and you have to go to Christian worship. That begins to change because by the year approximately 1000, it's turn of the century. So much happens around the turn of the century, year 1000. As one scholar has put it, everybody in Europe was Christian except for the Jews. Jews are another problem altogether. But the pagan tribes have all become Christianized. The question is, now that we're Christian in that sense of baptism and Christian worship, how do you then live as a Christian? And this starts this process that I've called religionization. We have it here on the slide, from Christianization to religionization. Christianization is the process of basically of converting pagans, of making people's Christian, new people's Christian. Religionization is then giving that kind of content for how to live a Christian life. What does it really mean now that we're Christian? And for most of this time, that didn't mean a whole lot, except we were baptized and attended Christian worship. Religionization is, how do we make people follow the Christian religion in their daily lives? That kind of endeavor and process really started becoming the focus beginning around year 1000, especially further into about 100. It's generally called the Renaissance in the 12th century. And that is still going on, as we will see, in some ways throughout the rest of this course. This process of religionization. How do we make people live their Christian lives? So there's an emphasis on teaching people what they need to know, teaching people what is right and wrong. And this is a whole new development within Christianity, within Europe, within Christendom. So it's not just a Christian empire in name, it's also how do we actually live our beliefs and our faith. That became the focus. And that was very important. And will be, as we'll see, go along and get further later developments. Thereafter, I have up there the three orders: those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. That was a formulation in the 12th century, codifying feudal relationships. So much you probably have heard of feudalism and feudal Europe. And again, it would take us too far afield for me to explain really what feudalism was, or what a fief was, and a feudum in Latin, and how that all worked out, and what difference did it make. But if we think of it as the kind of idealized, conceptualized, legal explication, what it ended up being was the classifying individuals within Christendom, keeping with three orders. And the term ordo, Latin, or order, is one of the most important medieval Latin words in some ways. It can mean different things in different contexts. Here it is almost like the class of people. Class is a 19th century term, and so it's anachronistic to refer to the three orders as three classes, three groupings, three types of people we can think of in some ways, three distinct orders. And those were those who fought, or the nobility, those who prayed, or the clergy, and then those who worked, everybody else. So if you were not a member of the nobility, if you were not a member of the clergy, you were by definition a peasant. That was a problem. I have up there too, manorialism. I just put it up there because it always goes together with feudalism. It's distinct. The lord of the manor was responsible for the manor, usually a knight, but not always. And talking a lot about manorialism too. In some ways, manorialism was the socioeconomic structures of Europe, of medieval Christendom, and feudalism was the political, cultural structures of medieval Christendom. But one of the important things to keep in mind with manorialism is that the lord of the manor was responsible for his peasants. And that meant not only their physical well-being, but also their spiritual well-being. So at every manor, there would be a little village, be a church. And that was the Lord's church, something called a proprietary church. They took the responsibilities very seriously. Provide for them. And I'm not saying that everybody did. Obviously, that's not the case. Whenever we have an ideal and a principle, not everybody follows it, obviously. But yeah, the concept, the idea, was that if you're Lord of the Manor, the same as if you are prince, you are responsible for your subjects. And that starts at the manor level. It also goes up to the duchy level, the dukedom level, and all the various count levels, the various political entities within Christendom. And all the way up to the king, and then all the way up to the emperor. In terms of princes and emperors and kings and things, they were responsible for the eternal salvation of their subjects. They were going to have to answer to God when they died in heaven. How well had they done just that? Were they responsible custodians for the spiritual well-being and the souls of their subjects? So in this sense, there was an inherent interest in being responsible for the religious life within your territory, whether that was a manor, whether that was a duchy, or whether it was a kingdom. The prince was responsible. And so you can begin to see that led to all kinds of conflicts, and we'll be getting to shortly in a second. But we have to have that mentality and realization there. It wasn't this dichotomy, talking about a lot between, first of all, between church and state, did not exist. That is a misnomer. So I don't want you ever to think about the conflict between church and state. There's a conflict in terms of power over lay power and ecclesiastical power, and that was very real. Talking about that explicitly shortly. But on the lay side, there was a sense of, if I'm a prince, And if I'm taking my responsibilities seriously, I need to provide for the well-being of my peasants, my subjects, including their spiritual well-being, including providing for their eternal salvation. If I don't, I will have to answer to God for that. It's an awesome responsibility. Now, that brings me, I believe, one other thing before I get salvation at stake issue, to the rise of cities, which I have there with the three orders as well. Those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. And certainly the priests, the clergy, too, had a sense of I'm responsible. I should have brought that in, too, because if you're a parish priest, you're responsible for your parishioners. If you're a bishop, you're responsible for your flock. And so there was almost a dual level of responsibility for the well-being of people as such. Now, the reason I have these, the rise of cities underneath the three orders is precisely because they don't really fit. I said that the three orders were the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry, which was everybody who wasn't a clergy or a noble. But around the year 1000 again, this wonderful year, approximately everything starts happening, at the year 1000. The population in Europe is increasing. New technologies, new agricultural technologies led to a dramatic increase in the food supply, so that leads to the rise of population. So then, what do we do? And we start finding the growth and the establishment of cities, towns and cities throughout Europe. It's going to be charted and plotted on the map. So it's talking about the rise of cities. And what do we do in a city? There are the artisans. There are the people who are in business and traders. There are the bankers. There's a whole level of types of people who are not directly involved in farming the land as peasants, even though there's also a whole series of wealth in terms of peasants, from very fairly wealthy peasants to really down and out peasants. There's not really a single type of peasant. Actually, one of my professors I not directly but indirectly worked with a little bit in graduate school wrote a book called Peasant Classes at various levels within the so-called peasantry, which again was a legal designation and simply meant if you weren't part of the clergy or weren't part of the nobility, you were classified as a peasant. But somehow merchants, especially as trade really started to pick up, as banking started to pick up, and merchants were becoming very wealthy and bankers were becoming wealthy, it didn't seem really right that they were like peasants. They didn't really fit into this concept of the three orders. This whole structure that had been established and created started showing cracks. And those cracks just continued until finally, eventually, the whole kind of structure fell apart. Now, another aspect of the cities is that they felt, some of them anyway, started beginning feeling, why are we still within this feudal structure where we are directly responsible, each individual within the city, as a subject of our direct feudal overlord? Why can't we come together and see if we can function as a unit, as a corporate body? In some ways, this is the origins of corporate law. It starts in the guilds, trade guilds, and then goes to the cities, or communes, as they were called in French, or the free imperial cities in the empire. I'll get to. They petitioned the prince or the king. So they went over their local overlord. They said, we want to receive a charter from you. We will give you our feudal dues, but we'll do so as a unit, as a corporate body. And that ended up being a great concept and deal for the princes, too. And so these, let's say, charters or letters of incorporation, we still have incorporated cities today. Most cities are incorporated. This is kind of the beginning of this corporate nature and structure, where the city was then placed outside the feudal hierarchy. which also caused tension. It also gave the city the sense of we are self-governing. We can run our own affairs. We function as an entity in and of itself. See the importance of the imperial cities later on. They're some of the main conduits for which the spread of Luther's ideas and the spread of the Reformation and their political importance for the Reformation as such too. So that's why I wanted to come back here to talk about the rise of the cities that begins around the year 1000, how central and important the cities were in this concept of we are free imperial cities, or we're communes. We're not subject to our direct feudal overlord. See another whole development of being exempt from direct overlordship. Later on, when I talk about monasticism, that also develops about the same time, but we'll get there shortly. Point here is with this idealized legal definition of Christendom, kind of defined as orders, that kind of begins to crumble and fall apart. And that was not really seen at the time. It was certainly by legal scholars and people in authority recognized as potentially a problem. What do we do with these people? But the overall view was still salvation was at stake. That was a big deal. And why was it a big deal? Because people accepted Christianity. It was not an issue of the heart or mind so much. It was simply an issue of practice. People believed in an afterlife. And so much of medieval developments, thereafter going into the Reformation developments, if you didn't believe it, things wouldn't really make a difference. You'll see some of that in the conflicts there. So it was really based on everyone believing their eternal soul would end up either in heaven or earth. Not just again within Europe, that is, except again, especially after the year 1000, with this onset of and development of the religionization, by which we learn how to live, that became even more of an issue of you need to live a certain way if you're going to achieve salvation. And what are the basic requirements? Jesus says, be baptized and follow me. What does that following Jesus really mean now? It means a lot more than simply going to Christian worship, celebrating the Christ. It was starting to begin content about conduct, morals, and ethical values, and how we should live our lives to receive of our relationship to others in the world and everything else, and what are the doctrines that we need to learn. I'm coming back and talking more about that as well, but the whole kind of hinge point was, why should I live a certain way? Well, if I believe it does have something to do with my eternal salvation, I better. Because if that is put at jeopardy, it's going to be really bad for me. That's kind of some of those contexts, basic structures of the concept of Christendom. That was, it was never a unified political. But shortly there was divisions and family and fighting constantly between popes and emperors, popes and kings and other princes, between countries within Christendom. And I've often related to the concept of Christendom as a family. I know there are different types of family structures, but I'm not really necessarily referring to my own family, because mine must have been strange, but I know of other families, especially like with brothers. And brothers could fight each other fiercely. And yet, if someone else attacked one of them, they both would jump in. A family could fight together and bicker together all over the place, but yet they would work as a unit if the unit itself was threatened. And Christendom was kind of like that. It was like a family that was bickering and fighting and killing each other, but over against the outside, the externals, there's a unity. And that unity is the concept. That unity is the concept. That is that myth of Christendom. That was what led to the Crusades, at least in part. That was what led to the sense of still, with all the fighting, we need to work together to find a solution to how to govern ourselves. And even within that family kind of unity, mythic context, there was conflict. And there was conflict because the question was, if Christendom is a geopolitical entity, who's in charge? Who rules it? Who has the final say? That brings me then to the next slide, competing hierarchies. Medieval Christendom was structured hierarchy. No question. But there was not just one hierarchy. There were two. The ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy. And there were some overlaps. I'll show you in a second. But this is in some ways the behind what has so often, if not usually, been referred to as the conflict between church and state. It was not that, as I already said. We'll see that that's not the case. Go from here. But these hierarchies were based on responsibility and the authority that began with God. If we go to the next slide, this repeating hierarchy slides will be repeated after this next one. The next slide, ecclesiastical and lay hierarchies. Here you'll see, as you're looking at the screen, ecclesiastical hierarchy on the left, lay hierarchy on the right. The head of Christendom, both kings and princes and emperors and popes and cardinals and bishops and archbishops, everyone agreed was God. God was the head. Christ was the head. Christ was, whatever. But yet, then, that was when it got problematic. Because on the ecclesiastical side, the Pope, in a whole series of developments, that again were very complex. I can't go into the specifics here. Pope viewed himself, his office, as being the direct ruler for God on earth. The Vicarius Christi, the Vicar of Christ, which actually was a term that became relatively formally referred to as a pope, beginning long development by the Fourth Lateran Council and Innocent III, excuse me, Pope Innocent III, was seen as the Vicar of Christ, Vicarius Christi, as the person who ruled for Christ on earth. Previous to that, the emperor viewed himself as the Vicarius Dei, Vicar of God. Powers that be were ordained of God. Constantine was the divinely established emperor who established the very foundational doctrines of Christianity at the Council of Nicaea. That was the emperor's role. And within the empire, in this concept, there were kings and princes and other principalities, but they were all theoretically underneath the emperor. Now, there was also conflict between princes and the emperor too, but that was kind of there too. So there's this conflict between who was in charge, who really did rule directly for God. Was it the Pope and the papacy, or was it the emperor and the lay hierarchy? On the ecclesiastical side, we have the Pope, and then we have the archbishops, and then the College of Cardinals with advisory bodies. They can be any ordained person can be established as cardinal. Pope, archbishops, bishops, priests, and everybody else, the people. Archbishops in charge of archdiocese, bishops in charge of diocese, priests in charge of the parish, each with the authority, the jurisdictional authority to administer their territory, so to speak. On the other side, the lay hierarchy, we have God, then we have the emperor, and underneath the emperor are kings, kings of France, kings of England, dukes, counts, and margraves, and individual knights, and the people. Now, a lot of overlap was there, because in terms of nobility. You look at the lay hierarchy, everything from the knights on up were part of the nobility. Most of, not all, but most of the bishops and archbishops and popes were part of the nobility. Second sons, third sons, sent into a career in the church. So there was a real fusion of, noble families in both hierarchies, which could cause tensions very well. Also, we have to consider, I use the word jurisdiction for, dioceses and archdioceses. It was very much the case of jurisdiction. And the concept was that if you're a bishop, you are also have jurisdiction temporally over your bishopric. You have to be very kind of intertwined. It's called the spiritual and the temporal. There have been conflicts and problems over that relationship going all the way back, at least to the 5th century. That's what Pope Gelasius, who tried to come up with a solution to how that worked out. The idea was the spiritual side of things. Certainly the clergy is in charge of. Whereas the temporal, the body, the laity is in charge of. And those two shouldn't interfere. Except it was a constant interference. And of course, here's one good case. In the cause of sin, or in the case of sin, sin is a spiritual entity. And so the ecclesiastical hierarchy is in charge of sin and its remission and dealing with sin and salvation. But if you're a prince and you attack and go to war with another Christian prince, that could be seen as a sin. And so the bishop might say, you can't do that. That's a sin. He said, you leave me alone. This is my temporal affairs. Leave me to deal with this as I see fit. This is not just temporal. This is spiritual. This is an issue of sin. Now, that's the issue of the conflict. What constituted sin and part of the spiritual? What constituted simply being temporal? The spiritual also needed defending and needed temporal help. Everything from, if the church is being attacked, the lay hierarchy, the nobility needed to come to the defense. And so there was this very strange situation. This concept of this complete separation did not exist. The idea that, ecclesiastics were, spiritual people, they were, some of them maybe, but they were leaders, they were authoritative figures, they were governing their territories, and sometimes ruthlessly so. And there was a lot of intermixing and interacting. And we'll talk about later about the electors of the emperor. But in Mainz, it's a 19th century development along the Rhine River. There's a monument to the 7 electors. The 7 electors who elected the emperor was established in 1356 with the Golden Bull of Emperor Charles IV. There were 4 lay electors and 3 ecclesiastical electors. The ecclesiastical electors were the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. The lay electors were Duke of Saxony, Margrave of Brandenburg, Count Palatine, and the King of Bohemia. So they were the ones who got together, those 7, after 1356. Before that, there was debate and conflict over who could really vote for the emperor. And those 7 would then elect the emperor. This would become very important for us in our story with Luther. There's the electors, and we'll get there when we get there. It's a significant factor in Luther's development case. That's why I'm bringing it up. But my point here is this monument in Mainz. All 7 electors are portrayed in full armor. You can only tell who are the ecclesiastics by certain symbols that they're endowed with, not because they're not in full armor as full knights. That is this joining and and almost fusion of the lay and the temporal and practicalities that was there. Later, they become referred to, a lot of bishops become referred to as prince bishops. They lived as princes and functioned as princes, even though they're bishops. That to itself caused a lot of problems. We'll be talking about some of those as we go along. That's just what I want to try and get at in terms of this tension between the lay hierarchy and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. It was not a separation. It was not a fusion. It was not. It was an inherent structural tension with almost what can we do about it to try to work things out. And it had never really been worked out, even for some major conflicts over the years from time to time. It was all based on the power. The lay power was based on, the sword, military power. Go in, I can force you to do something. The ecclesiastical power is based on salvation and the sacraments. Because if we withheld the sacraments from you, which, if I'm a priest or bishop, I can do that. So no, you're excommunicated. That is effectively almost saying that you are condemned to hell. And if you believe that, that's something. Now, you certainly have cases like with Gregory VII, Pope Gregory VII, and Emperor Henry IV, where Henry finally got disgusted with Gregory and didn't listen to his proclamations of being excommunicated. Henry very much believed in heaven and hell. He just didn't believe Gregory knew what he was talking about when Gregory, in Henry's view, completely illegitimately excommunicated him. And illegitimate excommunication is not an excommunication. So therefore, Henry could say, to you, Gregory. That's the kind of thing. So there's a fundamental basis of belief underneath. And the conflict between Gregory and Henry is far more complex than that. And the first time Gregory excommunicates Henry, Henry capitulates because all of his subjects did accept it. And so he had a real political problem. But that's another issue. These two hierarchies are in conflict and struggle, trying to govern Christendom. The big question is, who has primacy? Who has the ultimate say? That had never been settled. There were conflicts, there were fights, there were battles, there were all kinds of issues. It certainly was not that everybody simply listened to what the Pope said. That is so often put out there, so to speak, and then Luther was the first to stand up against the tyrannical authority of the Pope, where people in the Middle Ages never thought for themselves. They just accepted whatever the Pope said and went on from there. That is as big of a complete misunderstanding and falsehood as you can kind of think of. It absolutely was not the case. Now, that still doesn't help us understand how things got together. So we need to go about a little bit more into the structures of the competing hierarchies themselves. The papacy, there on that hierarchy, this is now going back to the competing hierarchy slide. The papacy was an elected office. The College of Cardinals elected the Pope, but theoretically, anybody could be elected Pope. That is something to keep in mind. It was discussed at the time, and even some theorists in the later Middle Ages, one of my people I study, Augustinus and Conan, or Augustinian Hermit, argued that a lay person elected Pope, and even someone who was not even ordained could be elected Pope, and would be Pope with all of the Pope's power based on jurisdiction, even though based on what's called the power of ordination, a lay person could not perform the sacraments, but could be elected Pope. Now, that never came about, but that was kind of the theory behind it. And so we have the issue, too, of this distinction between the Pope as an office and a Pope as a person. I think it can be very complex. It goes back, actually, has its origins in the 4th and 5th century in the Donatist controversy in North Africa with Augustine. That's also another issue. But that is an important distinction to make, because we will see Luther, on the one hand, writing to Leo, Pope Leo X, after he's already had his discovery about the papacy being the throne of Antichrist, but still writing to Leo almost as a fellow Christian, trying to help him, persuade him of Luther's rightness. But it's not exactly the same. The person is not the same as the office. Also, like Augustinus would argue, and others did too, is, could there be bad popes? And absolutely there can be bad popes. You need to follow a bad pope unless the pope is commanding you to be a heretic. Do not follow a heretical pope. You do have to follow a bad pope. There can be bad popes. But the office was what was holy and sacred. Pope embodied the office as well as simply being individual, who was elected by the electors, obviously seen as though part of God's divinely not only sanctioned but directed election. And with the empire, we have also an elected official. The emperor was elected. It was not an inherited office. There were dynasties there. We have the dynasties with the King of France, the King of England. Those were not elected. Those were inherited by the theories of succession. But the Pope, theoretically, was not to have offspring. That didn't prevent popes from having offspring. They had a lot of them here and there, known as papal nephews and nieces, and it was known at the time. But ideally, they weren't supposed to. So they couldn't. It could not be an inherited office. So it had to be elected. The empire was seen too as a divine office open to election. And then the question became who had the power and the right to elect the emperor. And that's why what I just referred to, that was established in 1356 in the Golden Bull of the 7 electors. But before then, it was the most powerful and important Christian or German princes. The empire was, on the one hand, ideally, as a myth, identified as all of Christendom. Yet, territorially, after the Treaty of Verdun in 843, all the way back to the breakup of Charlemagne's empire after the death of his son and grandson, it was divided into 3 parts. And the one son, Lothar, received the middle part of Charlemagne's empire and the title emperor. And that was what ended up becoming the Germanic state. I mean, there was no such thing as Germany until 1870. We have the German-speaking territories. Treaty of Verdun is really interesting. It's one of the first documents we have that was translated into what became early German and early French. The origins of modern Europe start there in 843 at the Treaty of Verdun. So by the time we get to our time, this idea of who's emperor, it's an elected office because we have too many powerful kings, princes, to settle on who's actually going to be the King of France, King of England. Theoretically, we're underneath the emperor, but practically not at all. And look at the coronation rituals for the King of France. It's also he's ruling directly for God. It all goes back to the breakup of Charlemagne's empire, who was actually the successor of Charlemagne. Again, another story that would take us too far afield. The point I want to make here, though, then, is the 2 competing offices for ruling Christendom were both elected offices. That is very important to know, as we'll see coming to the 16th century, and even the 16th century too. And it was, though, a conflict as well between lay power and clerical power, which I've already talked about a little bit. It's temporal and spiritual. The sacramental system. Sacraments were defined as a visible sign of an invisible grace. And the number of sacraments have been debated for quite a while. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the sacraments were determined as being 7. At that council, too, one of the sacraments being the Eucharist, was defined as being based on transubstantiation, drawn from Aristotle's philosophy. I'll be talking more about that later. That's important to note. It goes back to number 1, Aristotle, number 2, 12:15. But these were the means of grace by which one could achieve salvation or be granted salvation in heaven. That it's into this whole complex of how does one get into heaven? What is justification? How does one become justified to be accepted into heaven? That was, in some ways, the whole question on which the Reformation began. In any case, but we'll get back to that when we get back to it. But it's this is the context in which it develops, and these are the sacraments, which is the basis of the ecclesiastical power, because the ecclesiastics, the priests, the bishops, the archbishops, all the way up to the papacy, certainly had complete control over the sacraments, to the point where it was argued too in papal theory, papal hierocratic theory, meaning the theory that placed the Pope above the emperor, that even the simple parish priest, in one way, has more power than the emperor, because the ordained parish priest, an ordination was a sacrament that affected your soul. The priest, an ordained priest, would go into an altar, say Mass at the words of institution, Hocus Corpus Meum. The elements of bread and wine would be physically transubstantiated into the actual body and blood of Christ. God present, Christ present physically right here that we receive. The emperor could not do that. The emperor could go into St. Peter's on Easter Sunday in all pomp and glory, go up and say Mass, he could say it perfectly, and nothing would happen. There would be no transubstantiation. He did not have that power because he was not ordained. That's an issue. That struggle between the power of ordination and the power of jurisdiction to cause conflict between the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy throughout the later Middle Ages and on into the 16th century and beyond. We'll see some of those and get there. Which then brings me to I have heresy up there. I need to get to at the sacramental system. Because that is an issue, and is also one where lay power and clerical power actually cooperated. Because heresy is defined as wrongful. It actually stems from the Greek word hieresis. And it goes back to being simply the philosophical school that one followed, one's choice. Hieresis is really a choice of philosophical school. But with Christianity, that became distinction between orthodoxy or right teaching, heresy, false teaching. There was a lot of struggle from very early on within the Christian tradition. Being like, who was Jesus of Nazareth? Was Jesus of Nazareth the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity? Was Jesus the Son of God? If he was the Son of God, was Jesus the adopted Son of God, or was he, the existent Son of God? How does all that work? And that took a while to work out. And there was a lot of leeway for quite a long time. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is once a heresy is proclaimed, does not mean it ceases to exist. It does not mean that anybody who is caught following that heresy is burned at the stake. Burning at the stakes didn't really happen for quite late. There was, beginning the 14th century, there's a few burning of heretics, kind of got further and further, or increased. But it was a capital punishment, heresy was. The clergy did not execute heretics. The state, being a heretic, was against a crime against the state. This goes all the way back to Theodosius, proclaiming Christianity the only legal religion. If you were then under Theodosius, technically, if you were then not a Christian, if you were a pagan, you could be executed or exiled because it was against the law of the state. That then kind of continued within the myth of Christendom, heresy, as it's a crime against the state, heresy is. theologians have to determine what is heresy. The ecclesiastical hierarchy has to determine what is heresy, then judge who is a heretic, but it's the lay power and hierarchy that then punishes and deals with heretics. That too is very important. It goes back to this concept of the lay princes, from the almost the lord of the manor to all the way up to the emperor, kings between as well, are responsible for the salvation of their flock, of their subjects. This is where it comes together to. And so here, in some ways, with heresy, the lay hierarchy and the ecclesiastical hierarchy work fairly well in harmony, even if there's significant conflicts thereafter. That then brings me to the issue of the church. I've already asserted, I'll probably assert more and more, that there was no such thing as a conflict between church and state. That is something I want you to try to grasp and get through your head. Out this course, throughout the Middle Ages, this idea that church and state being separate is a relatively recent development. That will not change with the Reformation. There are two kinds of forms here that we can see. The papal, or the ecclesiastical form, and the lay, or the lay form. Remember, both hierarchies are led by the lay hierarchy, not exclusively, but in general, was arguing for kind of state-church approach, whereas the ecclesiastical hierarchy was arguing for a church-state approach. They're both one and the same. The term church, every theorist I've ever read, and I've read not every one, but a lot of them, define the church most basically as communion of the faithful, the body of the faith, basically Christians. Then they started diverging depending on your theological philosophy and theory on the papal side or the princely side. And so there were people certainly that argued that the church, in a more specific sense, can be identified with the ecclesiastical hierarchy. But in the most general basic definition of church, it included everyone. The most radical treatise of the later Middle Ages, the entire Middle Ages, actually was Marcellus Padua's Defensor Pacis, written in 1324, where he argued that the papacy should be abolished. The clergy should continue. The clergy is a necessary function of the Christian state. What is necessary to state as such is religion. Religion is necessary. Priesthood is necessary for a state, even if it's not Christian. But in a Christian state, the priesthood is necessary. But this hierarchy, you should get rid of. It's a human institution. That was in 1324. Church state, the emperor should decide. And the council of all the Christians, Unio Fidelium, union of all the faithful, decide on church policy and church doctrine. The emperor at the lead. That was very different from response to Marcellius, even though the theory had been developing, as Augustinus of Ancona, who might argue, claimed that it's the other way around. But the papacy is the highest. The Pope is highest as an office, again, because there certainly can be bad blood. And the lay hierarchy is to serve the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Because why? What's more important, the body or the soul? The soul is. Therefore, the clergy is above the laity. And we can go more of that theoretically all we want. But what I want you to try to grasp and think about in terms of approaching what's going to be happening in the 16th century is that there is no conflict between church, or there is no conflict between church and state. There's a conflict between ecclesiastical power and lay power. That's what we're getting at. What we will see in terms of the Reformation is that in those political entities, those countries, those territories that followed Luther and broke from Rome, we have the emergence of state churches. In some ways, often been seen as, the Reformation begins, toleration. No, I'll be arguing the Reformation begins the increasing lack of toleration. That gets back to issues we'll talk about when we get there. That's why the concept of church is a complex one. And we have to keep that in mind as we are approaching the developments that we'll be getting to the next week, actually. One final then aspect of Christendom I want to address is monasticism. Because that was major development, but for no other reason is because Luther referred to himself as a monk. He technically was not a monk, technically he was a friar, member of the Order of the Hermits of St. Augustine. But what was the whole basis of monks and monasticism? I'm just going to go through this very briefly. The origins of Western monasticism goes back to the early church and the Desert Fathers. The idea is something like this. I really want to pursue my own salvation. I should give it everything I got. Can I do so living in society? Not really. There's too many distractions. I need to devote everything I can to God. So, first individuals and then groups started drawing from society to pursue their own spiritual development, seeking their own salvation. The first groups became known as monks, based on monachus, one individual, even though they lived in groups. And then the problem becomes, now that we're a group, we need rules by which we live by. So there were monastic rules. And the earliest Western monastic rules, the Rule of St. Augustine, even though most people attribute the earliest rule to the Rule of St. Benedict. Kind of been, in my view, persuasively shown that the Rule of St. Benedict is a rule, but it was attributed to this person, Benedict, who really never existed, but that's a whole other issue. The Order of St. Benedict that becomes the monks, following the Rule of St. Benedict. And they are to pray 7 times a day. They withdraw from society. They pray for society, but they live outside the cities. And in Northern Europe, there's no desert you could go to. I mean, some of the earliest monks and ascetics were, back in the 2nd or 3rd and 4th centuries, went out to the desert, from the Desert Fathers, as they were called, St. Anthony being the first ones, to test themselves, to get away from the pleasures of city life and everything. In Northern Europe, there's no desert, but there are woods. There have been a lot of wooded areas. They would go into the woods and establish a monastery somewhere away from society, even as they would be praying for society. And again, the word ordo was used, the ordo monasticus, the order of monk, being a monk, status of being a monk. And that was actually defined as a lay status. The problem was, if you have a group of people, or first groups of people, who are following this Christian life or being a monk, they need the sacraments. So you need a priest for that. Pretty soon dispensations were granted so that individual monks could be ordained so they could become priests. Now, beginning in the, Cluny is 910, so the early 10th century, there began to be a sense of we need to reform ourselves. This began with Cluny, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly, in a second. And then we also have the regular canons and the Cistercians, so that the new monasticism refers to Cluny, or Clunaic monasticism, the regular canons and the Cistercians. Why no? Cluny said, we need to reform. If a group of guys living together, it's going to kind of go downhill probably pretty quickly. Standards and stuff, if you know what I mean. Anyway, if that's not the case, fine. So Cluny said, we can't really do that because our bishops don't really care. Our bishops, would rather be off playing Prince somewhere than actually helping us live our life. So they appeal to the Pope, Cluny. So, okay, we want to do something different. We want to be outside of episcopal control, just like the cities did with their feudal structure. Cluny said we want to be outside episcopal control. We would be directly under your authority. Then, instead of simply, if we get too big, establishing another house, we're going to grow it out. So we have a mother house, a Cluny, and then if we get too big, we'll split off into 2 houses. Those daughter houses, though, will still be under the authority of the abbot, the head of the monastery, a Cluny. When those get too big, same thing. There'll be kind of a pyramid scheme. So all of a sudden, the abbot of Cluny in time becomes a very, very powerful person, the head of all the Benedictines. Now, that structure, outside of episcopal control, directly under the power, the authority of the papacy, and that hierarchical structure rather than individual groups, became also the structure for new monasticism of the pretty much of the regular canons and the Cistercians. Cistercians were simply also following the rule of Saint Benedict. They were a reform of Cluny, because after a while, Cluny became kind of corrupt in their view, and the monastery of Citeaux, they had a reform movement, and they were going to be the Cistercians. Also then directly under the Pope. So they form a new order, the same structure as Cluny. The regular canons are a bit different. Now, the regular canons, a canon technically was a priest attached to a cathedral. Cathedral canons. And why was that needed? Because the idea is that every priest is in charge of a parish. Cathedral, which is the bishop's church. You can't have a cathedral without having a bishop. You can't have a bishop without having a cathedral. And the diocese is then comprised of different parishes. But the bishop wants to be, a prince. He doesn't want to sit and listen to, confessions every day and preach every day, all those tedious jobs. So what the bishop would do is appoint priests to serve the cathedral, perform the sacraments and the care of souls, as it was called, for the diocese, for the parish of the diocese. They're called canons. Pretty soon, beginning in actually Cistercians of 1079, beginning around the end of the 11th century, beginning of the 12th century, some groups of canons said, you know what, we should start living a more religious life too. We will follow a monastic rule. Now, they couldn't really follow the rule of St. Benedict, because that was more of a monastic approach. When we're priests, we are, very much involved in the active life, not the contemplative life of the monk, but the active life of caring for people. What was the rule that we will adopt? We'll adopt the rule of St. Augustine. Augustine was a monk and a bishop. He wrote his rule for his monks, but he was also a bishop. They followed the rule of St. Augustine. They're known as the regular canons because they followed a rule. Latin rule is regula. So we have then the regular clergy, and they were all clergy. The regular clergy, those clergy following a rule, namely the Augustine canons, the Augustine and the regular canons, and then those exempted Cistercians and Benedictines and Cluniacs who were ordained, basically not because they were part of being a monk, because technically you weren't supposed to be ordained as a monk, but they had dispensation, but you were still then a priest. And so if you were a priest who was a monk, you were part of what's called the regular clergy. If you were just a common parish priest, you were part of the secular clergy. Secular in this context did not mean, secular without religious, it meant of the world, in the world. Saeculum in Latin referred to this age. Augustine used it to refer to, hoc saeculum. This age, this world, this temporal existence that we live in. The parish priest, what we would consider this is just an inversion of what we think of. The regular priest is a parish priest, is a secular priest. Regular, in this sense, it refers to those following a rule. So we have this whole movement of priests who are preaching to people, who are listening to confession, who are now following a monastic rule, part of this whole religionization process. How do you live a Christian life? This is how, for them anyway. They weren't saying that everybody had to become a regular canon or a Cistercians, so they had to. Now we have a new development too in the 13th century, the Mendicants. And it starts with the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinian Hermits, the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine. The Mendicants were a new group too, because they were explicitly founded to preach and teach the people. It starts with Francis, St. Francis and the Franciscans, and then St. Dominic and the Dominicans. And then in 1254, Pope Alexander IV saw that, we need another one because the Franciscans are doing great work. The Dominicans are, but they're also not doing it all the time. I'm going to form a new order. We have all these groups of hermits in Italy, primarily, who are following Augustine's rule of St. Augustine. I'm going to form them into a single order, the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine, which Pope Alexander IV does, 1256. He directs them to the cities. So all of a sudden, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinian hermits are, by definition and by papal command, are directed to preach and teach the people. Again, part of this religionization, trying to reach the people. And the word was the winning of souls, the lucra animarum. We have to go out and win souls, and the care of souls, the cura animarum. And this led to a new definition of what the contemplative life was. The contemplative life, the monk out in the wilderness, out in the wild, pursuing their own salvation, as opposed to the parish clergy in the cities, preaching and ministering to the people living the active life. For Jordan of Quedlinburg, 14th century Augustinian hermit, one of the people I studied, he defined it differently. He said the contemplative life is the life that anything to do with the soul. Preaching, teaching, is all part of the contemplative life. The active life is taking care of the physical body. And so all of a sudden, religious acts that had been seen part of the active life are part of the contemplative life for Jordan. Which for Jordan meant they were based on the hermit's own contemplation that then Jordan said we need to bring to the people. We sit alone in contemplation, but then we have to bring the fruits of that to the people. He says, this is not just the perfect life. This is the most perfect life. It is embodied in the Augustinian hermits and the rule of St. Augustine, who was both a monk and a bishop. That is the context for Jordan, why Augustinian hermits, why studying becomes so important, because also, too, everybody talks about the Franciscans and Dominicans. Not all that many people talk about the Augustinian hermits, though they had huge impact on late medieval and early modern Europe, because that was the order that Luther joined, and all kinds of other connections as well. It's kind of basis of my research and my story. For us, that's what we know is the origins of this Luther's own order. They were a newer mendicant group, and mendicant comes from begging. Beg, and they were supposed to beg for alms to be supported by the people they would be serving. And all three of these mendicant groups, and there's another one, the Carthusians, but that's a whole other issue, caused tensions with the parish clergy. And all of a sudden, they would go into town, and where would there be a town with a parish church? Now there was a town with a parish church, and then there was the Franciscan convent, there was the Dominican convent, there was the Augustinian convent, all offering the same Mass, offering religious services, offering to help people. This caused a real tension between the parish clergy or the secular clergy and the regular clergy, or the mendicants, because they were also ordained. They were a new order. They didn't really fit either. They're also ordered the same way as Cluny, meaning directly under the Pope, outside of episcopal control. So the bishop couldn't go into a city and say, this is my city, you mendicants get out of there. No, because the Pope would say, what? They're my people. They stay. There was conflict all over within the various hierarchies and tensions. And sometimes it broke out into serious conflicts. Other times it simply kind of simmered underneath. But these structural conflicts were almost like fault lines within Christendom, but beginning in the increasingly so, but then especially in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, started to open up, causing earthquakes for the crumbling of Christendom. But we'll get there as we get there. And this all comes back to the relationship, circling kind of back between the new mendicants and the princes and patres. Because if we go back, this is where increases the tension, because the princes, you go back to that idea that I tried to stress of princes being responsible for the salvation of their well-being, spiritual well-being of their subjects. The mendicants were the newest and brightest. They were the best they could possibly have. The princes start supporting the mendicants and start establishing the mendicants in different ways, and giving privileges to the mendicants, not just the Pope, but also the kings and princes and local rulers, as a way of their own process of religionization, caring for the religious well-being, the theological well-being, the spiritual well-being, and the salvation of their subjects. That's what it was all about. That's why also, too, the mendicants become so important, because they become almost fused with the political responsibility, when they took it seriously, of princes for their subjects. That would be important for understanding this before we continue next week with a lecture on the crisis of the later Middle Ages, and then the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. So this lecture, you'll hear things when I talk about the Reformation of the later Middle Ages that I've already brought up in this lecture. But in more, I'll deal with it more fully. That's when we really get into this period of the Reformation, getting to what is Reformation, time so often referred to simply as late medieval reform. Why? Because at the time, the sources demonstrate so clearly people are calling for a thorough Reformation. We're talking about that next week, placing that call for a Reformation within the late medieval crisis to begin next week. Thank you so much.